in the Bible, God shows us that he's committed to healing us, right? He calls us to be whole. He calls us not only to be physically whole, but spiritually whole, right? He said our bodies are a temple and we need to be sanctified. And if you have unhealed trauma, you're not going to be a whole person. It's almost impossible to navigate life from an unhealed place. The other reason why this is important scientifically, research showed that kids who experience adverse traumatic experiences, so for instance, they are neglected, they are raped, they experience war, they have a divorce in the home where a parents leave, or they are a victim of domestic assault, they grow up and become the perpetrator, right? So we need to break the cycle, because if you are traumatized as a person and you don't heal yourself, research shows that you will grow up and have adverse consequences from that, whether you are mentally ill, you turn to drugs and alcohol, some other ways of coping, or you have chronic diseases like, high blood pressure or something else. So scientifically, it's found that people who are traumatized grow up to be unhealed people, and therefore you need to, if you want to live a prosperous life that God calls us to be, that he wished that we all be in good health and prosper, you must heal your unhealed trauma, and that's important. Next. So what is trauma? Trauma we define as distressing, disturbing event that happened, right? And based on the experience, it leads to a negative outcome, right? So remember the 3 E's. That's how we define trauma scientifically. It's an event that happened, and based on that event, it's experienced by different people, and then it leads to a negative outcome, right? So for instance, in the Bible, in Job was a man of faith, but he lost everything, right? He lost his wealth, he lost his children, and his wife told him, curse God and die, right? Job was a man of faith, and through his traumatic experience, he became closer to God, he wept, and he was restored, right? So as Christians, we have an example on how, we can turn that pain into purpose. The other thing I want to say is the way you remember this is an event or a series of events that happen that cause you to perceive life a different way, and it can impact you. So for us, most of us here, we come from Liberia, was born in Liberia, and we experienced the war. The war was a series of events because it happened over 14 years. But people perceived the war differently, right? Someone who saw that parents got killed in front of them had a greater impact versus someone who was in the U.S. here and only have family members back there. So your perception of the event, it's important. It's what that determines your outcome. And as Christians, that is our advantage, right? Our perception is different from someone who's a non-believer. So Job, for example, Job saw that he lost everything, but he turned to God in his misery, right? We see on TV celebrities who appear to have everything, right? But when they lose stuff, they kill themselves. So as Christians, we have we have multiple protective factors. And protective factors are things, attribute, resources that you have that when you leverage or when you use, it can improve your outcome. So those resources are prayer, worship, praises, right? Relationship with God. Because it literally shows, research, and I will show you this, confirm that people who turn to God in times of worship or in times of traumatic experiences have a better outcome. So remember that trauma happens, so the war happened, people perceived it, and some people have PTSD. For instance, my mom, if she hears firecrackers, she ducks, right? That is unhealed trauma. So you just think about that. And traumatic events will always happen. We just have to understand how to take care of ourselves and rely on faith. Next slide. So there are 3 types of trauma. There's acute trauma. It happens. Single event, like you get in your car. He said, we came here by the grace of God. You get in your car, you get in an accident. That's a traumatic event. Most of the time when you get in an accident, you are in shock, so you don't feel any pain, right? That is a way of your body responding to that event. There's chronic trauma. This is serious events that happen over time. So like a kid being in a home with adults who experience multiple abuse, right? Or for us who lived in Liberia and we were in Liberia all 14 years, and we experienced World War I, World War II, and all of the wars, right? So there was multiple events that happened over time. Then there's complex trauma. Complex trauma happens when there are a series of events, that first E. So for instance, a kid is adopted at birth, right? So she's given away by her parents, and then she's adopted into a foster home that subsequently she's abused. Those are an example of complex trauma because the first trauma was the adoption, she being given away, and then she was subsequently abused. So it gets you complex traumas often you experience early on in your childhood, and it gets you to a place where you question your life, your self-worth, right? Am I worth it? Why did I even live? And these are the things, if we don't heal, we can have adverse outcomes. Next. So what causes trauma? I went through some of it. Trauma is caused by, it's man-made, it's natural, right? So the wildfires that happened in California, people didn't anticipate that homes will be burnt, right? Famines, flood, hurricanes. Traumas can also be man-made. They can be caused by abuse. They can be caused by living with someone who's traumatized. This is something we're going to talk about, secondary trauma. This is often experienced by spouse, children, pastors. So it's really important that even if you are healed as a person, the people around you, you want to make sure they're healed, because if they're not, they're going to traumatize you because they are traumatized. So it's a really important concept to understand. Also, trauma can happen from domestic assault. This is potentially a series of events that happen to people. It can happen from chronic poverty. Most of us who came from Liberia, we were poor. I see some people here that I know from Ghana. We stayed on a refugee camp for 8 years. And so these are things that can happen. And then there's discrimination, there's racism, there's, so many other things that can cause us. So I think what I'm saying from this slide is trauma is you're always gonna experience problems, right? My pastor said if you haven't experienced problems in life, you haven't lived long enough. So you need to be thinking about how you either can prevent it, or when it happens, how you can rely on your faith and other resources to address it. And as Christians, we are well positioned because we have tools, outside of science, right? We still need sometimes scientific resources, but we have the tools to prevent it and also build recovery and lead to restoration. So I gave an example here of another biblical son who experienced trauma, right? Joseph. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was imprisoned by, Potiphar's wife. And God used that pain, right, to turn into his purpose. So for us Christians, when things happen, I've been through so many things in my young life. I personally say things happen for you. They don't happen to you. That is an affirmation I use to be able to navigate troubles in life. I said, God, what are you trying to tell me? What is the lesson that you are trying to tell me in this trying times? And as Christians, we hear God will turn your task into your testimony. And these are some of the things that we know. We have the example. Not only we have the word that God said that he wants us to be in good health and prosper, but he also showed us biblical men and women who went through multiple problems, right? But he's still with them and he restored them. So as Christians, not only do we have the promise of God, but we see action as to how we can navigate these troubles. Next. This is why it's important to talk about this, and I want to say thank you to Pastor Collins again for championing this important issue. Trauma is prevalent. It's prevalent in African-born communities. Prevalent means it's widespread. And it's widespread because of so many reasons, but The main reason is that it happens to us before, during, and after migration, right? So, for example, most of us who were born in Liberia, we were born into poverty, right? Some of us, we went through the war. We had to be refugee. We stayed on a refugee camp, right? We saw our families member die. That was before migration. During migration, some of us, we bought spaces to come here. We left our families, or even if we were coming as a family, we left some of our loved ones behind. And the fact that we didn't know what would happen to them potentially could cause us great harm. Then, when you arrive in America, you have to fight a third battle, right? Immigration, racism, discrimination. So that's why trauma is prevalent in African-born communities, because you are facing trauma through many stages. And research shows that compared to a general population, right? If you just take someone walking on the street, 1 out of 100 will face trauma. But African-born people, we experience post-traumatic stress disorder at a rate of 39 to 100%. Imagine that. Imagine every single refugee has PTSD. That's why those are some of the systemic issues we have in our communities that, we tend to, face so many problems around domestic assault, violence, and all of that. And then also, coupled with that, people who are immigrants, they have high likelihood of being depressed, right? Anywhere between 47 to 72%. So we face all of these emotional issues from unhealed trauma, and I'll show you why. Next slide. So when trauma happens, or when traumatic events happen, it affects 3 places in your brain. And these places are important to be able to help you manage trauma, right? They help you manage stress. And they must work together in a coordinated fashion for you to be able to manage stress effectively. In the event when you have trauma, they are not functional, right? So for instance, your prefrontal cortex, right, is your decision-making component of your brain. This is your rational. This is how you tell right from wrong, right? Your hippocampus is the memory part of your brain. It helps you remember, differentiate between your past and your present. And then your amygdala is your emotional instinct part of your brain. So this is the part that helps you, ration fear, excitement, all of the different emotions. When traumatic events happen, all of these are not functional, right? Your prefrontal cortex, what is responsible for helping you make good decisions, right? In the event of PTSD, it reduces its volume, right? Your hippocampus, in the event of chronic stress, it shrinks. And then your amygdala, right, in the event of stress, is hypervigilant, right? So what does that do? So often when you experience a traumatic event, you tend to relive, right? You're always replaying the past because you want to make sense of it, right? People who are molested, they're always, even if it happened 30 years ago and they're not healed, they're always replaying. So you are literally living the present, but you're in the past, right? If you're also hypervigilant, meaning you are reactive, you have so much anger that anybody tells you stuff, it sets you off. And that's why it explains when you see some of these things in your loved ones, you need to, find help for them either in the church or outside of the church. But this explains why people who have these traumatic experiences, they are always stuck, right? Stuck on that event, right? Because they cannot differentiate the past from the present, your past become your present. They're always anxious. They don't trust anybody, rightfully so, right? And then they are disconnected because you can't rationalize. So you are disconnected from reality because you are constantly replaying that event. And so to be an unhealed person is a dangerous thing, right? We know from the science, right? Research say if you were born in a home and you were molested or you experience domestic violence, you are more likely to grow up and be a perpetrator, right? You will then turn around. You who were a victim, you would turn around and then be the person who inflicts harm on others, because that is the only way you know how. So it's really important when you see people dealing with these demons, these past issues that they're suffering with, you find them help, because eventually, if you're around them, it's going to impact you too. Next. So trauma also affects your body, right? So typically when, like within a car accident, you go into the shock, your bodies, shut down and you don't feel pain. But we typically have 5 responses that your body can do when you have these events. And it's primarily there, it's wired for survival. It's there to help you survive the event. So when it happens occasionally, it is a good thing, right? Because it's there to protect you from danger. However, if it keeps happening chronically all of the time, it has a potential to harm you, right? Harm you and your relationship and your family. So the first 2 we know, everyone has heard about this, right? It's activated by the central nervous system. It is your fight and your flight, right? When you are in a situation, some people want to fight back, right? They are aggressive, they're angry, they blame the other people. It's your fault. It's our fault. I'm going to get you. That is that reactive, way to blaming others and trying to get them to feel the same pain you feel, right? The other mechanism is to flight, right? To run away. You feel the urge to run away because you do not want to deal with the situation. Often people who do this, right, they want to be able to escape the pain, the situation. They don't want to deal with it. That temporarily is good, right? But chronically, if you're always running away from your problems, you are never going to solve them. So chronically, if that happens, that is a problem. The other 3, most of us, we don't know it, but these are also responses, right? It's freeze. I can't do it. You panic. You feel so disengaged. You think you just act like it never happened, right? This is where you freeze because you are overwhelmed and you don't know how to deal with it. The other one is flap, where you say, it is all my fault, right? I don't even think I'm worth it. This is like the pity party where you have this reaction like, it is all my fault. I'm never going to get past this. And then you sit in that space where you don't want to go to work. You don't want to be bothered with anyone because you blame yourself for the event, right? And then the last one is friend, where you can't deal with it. You feel hopeless. You feel helpless. You feel panicked. But you find someone and shift the blame, right? So this too, occasionally is good. But if you're always shifting blame and not taking responsibility for your problem, you're not going to solve it, right? So this is primarily you find someone and you don't take responsibility and you want them to solve your problems, right? So all of these mechanisms are ways your body protects you when you have traumatic experiences, while, instinctive when it happens occasionally is good to protect you. You should never get to a space where it's always happening. You're always fighting. You're always running away. You're always like freezing or flapping. These are not good for you. Next, how trauma affects your body, right? It's sad. I think this is one of the things in life that affects every single major part of your body, right? It affects you, emotionally. This is your PTSD, where you can't sleep. You're always stressed. You're always reliving your past. It affects your behavior. People who are traumatized often turn to drug and alcohol to cope, right? And they make the problems worse, right? Instead of finding healing, they go down this path where they are taking drug and alcohol to numb that pain, but it makes it work. We also know it makes it worse. We also know most of us have experienced this. Stress, cause your blood pressure to go up. You get headache, you get fatigue, right? That's a physical impact of traumatic experiences. Interpersonally, we don't want to be bothered. We are withdrawn. We tend to not want to be, we don't trust people anymore. Spiritually, I want to say this one because this is positive and negative. And I think this is the only category there that's positive and negative. And and we know this as Christians. So negatively, if you are depressed, you feel abandoned, you tend to blame God. Oh, why this happened to me? I don't even want to be a Christian anymore. I'm not supposed to go through this. You are totally disengaged. You lose your faith. Positively, if you have problems so long and you realize there's no other help, there's help coming from nowhere, right? Right? It draws you closer to God, right? You start to lift up. Yeah, this is where you turn to your mind can help you. You turn to your pa can help you. You said to yourself, okay, it looks like this is this problem is so great that God is the only person who can restore me. So that is the only category, and that should tell us something as Christian, where, spiritually, right, people can either do things. So that is the test, right? You have the option to choose the positive over the negative. You have the option to say, I don't want to be bothered with God. I'm going to lose my faith. He did this to me. I can't believe it. Or you have the option to draw near to God, and it is shown over and over in the Bibles, right? So that is your choice. This is your task that potentially, when done right, can be your testimony. Next. So secondary trauma. Secondary trauma we define as when you're living with or you're supporting someone who's traumatized, right? And you start to relive their experiences because they are telling you it or they are acting it. So, for example, a kid who was born here had parents who grew up in Liberia during the war, and they were explaining how this other person died, The kid may relive those experiences of their parents by being in close proximity and just hearing what happened to them, right? Similarly, pastors. So pastors, when someone in a church lost a family member, right? Pastors go there to provide grief counseling, and they go to stand in solidarity and help counsel them, right? But sometimes, too, they are so overwhelmed by the grief, right? And cry. I've heard pastors in so many places say, I go and try to counsel people and be strong, but then when I go to my office, I just cry because I, too, am trying to, cheer them up, but I just can't understand why this is happening, right? And so it's important, that's why this is important, that if you're around people who are traumatized and you don't help them recover, you eventually will be affected by that trauma. Right? So it is important, this is a responsibility we all have to take up to be able to support each other. Next. So how we prevent trauma and how we build resilience towards recovery. Jesus showed this where, he prevented harm. This was in John, I believe, and also he restored someone who was broken in Luke. So preventing trauma, it's easier when it is a situation that you can prevent. So like domestic violence and all of that, right? So the way we do this is we strengthen families, right? We make sure we have strong families so our kids are not abused. We make sure we promote safe environments, whether it is in our homes, our schools, our church, our community. We make sure that we reduce exposure to violence, abuse, and discrimination. We, try to get people who had the event resources to be able to recover, right? This is the important part that I want all of us to pay attention to, right? But as Christians, I think we have this burden. So we see in the Bible, Pharaoh had a decree that told the midwives that they should kill all of the Hebrew babies, right? When they were born, they should be killed. But because those midwives feared God, they did not do it, right? So they did not cause harm to those babies, and they did not cause harm to the families, because the families would have grieved, right, for the loss of their babies. This is important because if we fear God, We will not cause harm. We will not inflict harm on others. We will not cheat. We will not kill. We will not abuse. And so this is one of the things as Christians, if you literally just try to understand that inflicting pain on others will cause them to potentially, have poor outcomes, you will not do that. So fearing God is an important tool to be able to prevent trauma, right? And so even when trauma happens, recovery is possible, right? Resilience builds recovery. What is resilience? Resilience is an important trait in life. It means regardless of what happens, right, I am going to really trust God. I'm going to also seek help. I'm going to take this as an event that happened, but it's not going to break me. So how we build resilience? We support, people in relationship. We build supportive families. We rely on our faith practices that fosters hope and peace, right? We regulate our emotions, right? And you can do this scientifically by going through therapy. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, or you implement trauma-informed practices, right? And then you take care of yourself. I think that is important. Just take care of yourself. Self-care is an important concept. Next. So signs of unhealed trauma. I'm not going to go through the list, but I think guilt, shame is two that comes to mind right away. We know this is another biblical example where Peter, because he feared persecution and he wanted to save himself, he denied Jesus, right? 3 times, right? And Jesus was subsequently crucified. He was resurrected. And then he came back to his disciples, including Peter, and said, "Do you love me?" 3 times. And Peter said yes and professed his love for Jesus. And that was the start of his redemption and restoration. And we know that he went about preaching the gospel, right? So this is a good evidence that as Christians, even if we have unhealed trauma, we can be recovered and restored. Next. So these are, scientifically, there are evidence showing that people who engage in spiritual practices such as prayer, worship, praises, right, they have a higher level of emotional resilience, meaning that regardless of what happens, you're more likely to come up on top. And also, when things happen, they don't break you, they build you, right? There's post-traumatic growth. Research also showed that faith, right, can reduce stress and anxiety. And this one, we don't need science to tell us, right? If you think that God can solve your problem, will you worry about it? No, right? You will not worry about it. You give it to him. You may not sleep about it one night, but you give it to him and rest assured that he will solve it. But research showed that prayer and meditation lower your stress levels, right? This is research, right? And it shows that it also supports emotional regulation. Research also shows, and this is why this conversation is important, and this is why Pastor Collins, too, is championing this work. Research shows that community support, faith-based communities, right? If they provide support, it can reduce isolation, feeling alone, and it can also improve recovery. Research, this is the important part that I want us to hear as Christians. Research shows that these traumatic events, right? If you have these events, it changes your meaning making, right? It brings you to a space that you believe that there's a higher purpose, right, for you, and it helps you to reframe that event into hope for the future, right? And also, we see in the research that if we combine prayer, worship, and other spiritual practices with therapy, it helps us sustain healing, right? So regardless of what happens, we're not going to be broken. So there are scriptures there. I'm not going to go through all of it. But I think the most important scripture for me, I love all of the scriptures, but this is the one that I love the most, right? The Bible says, all things work together for good to them who love God. All things imply there will be bad things, right? He didn't say good things. He said all things. So as Christians, we are assured that regardless of what's going to happen, that's why, for me, our daily affirmation is, God, this is happening for me, right? It's not happening to me. It's happening for me. Because whether it is good or bad, you will change it into a purpose for me. Next. So the church and organizations, even in your home, there's ways to be trauma-informed. We do this by doing what we're doing now today. We need to realize the widespread of trauma. We need to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. We need to respond by embedding practices, policies, so that we create safe space for people to be able to recover and build resilience. The most important thing here is to resist re-traumatization, right? Do not make people who are already traumatized. So for instance, if a woman is divorced, do not say, oh, the church is not for divorced people, do not come here, right? The Bible, God came from those who were marginalized. So that is the place even she needs to be, or he needs to be, right? So do not re-traumatize people who are going through traumatic experiences. Next. So principles of traumas, right? We want to create safe space. We want to create policies that are transparent. We want to support each other, peer support, group counseling, pastoral counseling. We want to make sure we're collaborative, meaning that if Pastor Collins is coming up with a policy on how we create safe spaces, that he collaborates with members in the church to do it. We want to empower people. People who have lived experiences should be able to tell that story. It's going to help others survive or get through hard times. We want to also address some of our historical and gender biases and have policies to address that. Next. I think I have 3 more slides and then I'm done. What does God say to us, his children, about trauma, whether we're going through trauma or we are survivors of trauma? I'm not going to read all of this. I think Pastor Collins can share the slides with us. But I just want to say there's nowhere in the Bible that it said that you're not going to go through pain. It's impossible because all of God's children, we have examples in the Bible where people went through pain. What is said in the Bible and how we are assured, God said whether you go through the fire or water, he will be with us, right? We see this in Daniel in the lion's den, the 3 Hebrew boys in the fire. They went through traumatic experiences, but God was with them and turned that pain into purpose. So for people who are going through, suffering and despair today, I just want to reassure us that, most of the beloved people in the Bible, right? We have too many examples in the Bible that I can't even go over today. They underwent trauma and despair, but they came up on the top, right? So Job, King David, right? Moses, Naomi, they were all God's children. They experienced, death, famine, illness, hopelessness, but God was with them. He blessed them, right? And that is a reason for us to persevere, because we know if it happened to them, we too can experience it, right? Next. So this is how you can turn your pain into a purpose, right? And scripture, I'm just going to give a few examples how scripture shows God transforming trauma into, testimony, suffering into significant. So Joseph, we know Joseph's story. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery in prison, but he became the nation's savior. The very people that sold him into slavery, God used him to feed them, right? And so we see in the Bible, it says, what you intended to harm me, God intended for good. So this is the mentality I want us to have as Christians. When Paul was, persecuted and in prison, but he became the apostles. Because of Paul, we know so much of the early church, right? Job lost everything. He was devastated, but through his pain and suffering and lamentation, he drew close to God, right? And God restored him. David was a murderer. He was an adulterer. He was wounded. He was so many things, right? Haunted. But David became the worship leader. And because of what David went through, we have Psalms, right? We can say, I lift up my eyes unto the help, where coming my help, because of David's traumas, right? And what he went through. Jesus the ultimate symbol of our faith, right? Jesus was rejected and crucified, but in that, he became the Savior to all of us, right? And that he had to go through that ultimate suffering injustice to bring all of us who know him today to bring us salvation. And it says in Isaiah, I believe, through his wounds we were healed, right? Next. So, few things that I know of that's being done. Ebenezer Church, my church, this is how we embed trauma, informed care into what we do. For instance, pastors at the church, they'll preach about faith, resilience, and healing using the biblical examples to help people go through traumatic experiences. We also have a leadership training that trains pastors how to treat trauma and also take care of themselves. We have a training coming up on the 16th of this month. Pastors who participate, I believe they'll get $100. If you need to get more information, contact Pastor Tabla. And then we also know that we can't do it all. We connect people out. So if people need therapy or need mental health specialists, we refer them out. We do what we can as a church, but we also seek professional help when needed. Next. So this is the last slide, then I'm going to end. Also, I have a research and evaluation firm. We are working with Minnesota Department of Health to be able to provide resources for providers who are taking care of kids, whether it is in a hospital setting, daycare setting, to be able to help give them resources to take care of traumatic kids and also take care of themselves while they are taking care of kids. We have a training coming up on the 26th of this month. If you want more information about it, you can see me after church. I see Connor Gray here. He's also part of our team. You can also see him. And so that brings me to the end of my presentation. Next slide. This is my contact information, and I want to say thank you to Pastor Collins and the church for giving me the privilege to stand here and teach today. Thank you all.
You can stay on stage.
Yeah, I'm gonna stay on.
So give me 2 chairs, please. Was it helpful? You can be seated. So, Dr. Emma Boyce, PhD, welcome to CNN Interview.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Praise the Lord. Let's give the Lord a clap offering. This is fantastic. So, I'm going to give in. So, tell me, how does this affect relationships? So, Rebecca and I, we are at home. I'm screaming, yelling, and everything is false, and maybe 7 days a week we're acting with one another. How does that affect? Maybe I'm not respectful to her. I don't call her all day. How does that affect the relationship, and how does that create a traumatic relationship?
Yeah, I think that not only for between spouses, but it goes over to the kids, right? So as we said that, trauma can affect you personally, right? This person can be withdrawn, right? If you have a spouse who is always running away from conversations, they don't want to hear you, they may be withdrawn. This is where sometimes, this is the secondary, the behavior component where some people would turn to drugs, right? Others, like if you have a spouse who's not God-fearing, may turn to another person, right? This is also issue where there may be lack of trust, right? So it affects not only the marriage, but the children as well, right? Because research shows that kids who are born into or who lived under those circumstances where their parents are always arguing, where there's dysfunctional in their home, they go up and repeat that. They'll marry a spouse that will emulate those same things. And so that is the circle, that we have to break, right? If we want whole families, right, we need to start from our home. If we want whole communities, we need to start from our home. So it's really important as a father, the head of the house, to make sure that your wife is healed, your kids are not being victimized but by the tense relationship, right? And that's why I tell people it's not okay to just be married, right? If the marriage is toxic, you need to heal it. Because your kid, right? Kids, your inheritance, right? The Bible says a good father leaves an inheritance for his kids, but you are going to have kids who are wounded into the adulthood and will subsequently repeat those same issues. So it's really important as parents we're examples not only to God, but also to our homes and our children.
So, Mary, the first example was from the male perspective. Now, this is from a female perspective. So, growing up, let's say Joanne or whatever the name is, was sexually assaulted. And what are some ways that can play out in Joanne's marriage when it comes to intimacy?
Yes. So it's a really hard question because it depends, right? If Joanne is someone who is a Christian and relied on, God, right? It may be that she and her husband goes through a counseling and then she has this renewed faith that her husband is a protector and she's a lot more comfortable. If she's not, right, it's very hard to be intimate because you're constantly replaying that past. Even if that man is no longer around, most times when you interact with men, including your own husband, you are traumatized, right? And so it creates this gap where you may be withdrawn and not wanting to be able to fully participate in your marriage because you are unhealed. And so that's why premarital counseling is important. You should love someone regardless of that past, right? But if you ever come through an instant where you are with somebody who is traumatized, you need to find them the resources to help them heal because a whole person will be beneficial to you versus marrying someone who's unhealed. You will be traumatized secondly. So it will come over to you. So it's really important that when you understand someone has a past, you help them through the healing process. And I think it gives them this spirit of renewedness, right? That they have a protector, not only Jesus, but also in their home, and they live a whole life. But if in the event that childhood trauma is not healed, they may turn to drugs, alcohol, and make your marriage a living hell. And you don't want that.
That's a good answer, isn't it? Yeah. And then we're going to leave a minute or two for you to ask. We're going to take communion. We have a little bit of time. How do we create or build a trauma-minimized church? We cannot eradicate it 100%. But we can create safe space. We can minimize that. How can we, each one of us, as those who worship here, how can we have a church that minimizes the whole thing about trauma?
Yes. And I think the mistake we make is that the church is not the space. It's each of us, right? So we are the church. So when we say creating safe spaces, it means if I called you and tell you, oh, I'm going through this, you don't gossip, right? Because that is going to lead me to a place where I'm isolated, right? So safe spaces are important because you can say all the time, oh, this is a safe space. But it should be received that way, right? It should be I can come to Pastor Collins and tell him things and that he will counsel me and hold it there. And I know it's possible because there are people I know that pastors that know some troubling things, right? But they're still there in the trenches praying for their members. But again, like he said, the church is all of us. It's not just the building. It is us. So the way we do it is that if you're in group counseling or if you're creating a peer group where mothers who are abused can come and sit there and talk about their experiences so they're healed, right? You don't go out there and say, oh, you don't even want to know why I here to that group service. Because that way, right, you are not only shaming the person, right? We should always be thinking about what happened, right? It's not what happened to you, right? It's not you are the problem, right? We should see it through the lens of the victim. So when you are in safe spaces and people tell you something, I would say this: if you can't keep secret, don't be in safe spaces, right? Because some people know that. I mean, I know of a pastor, and I'll tell you this: he does not even tell his wife some of the things he hear, and that's true because in ministry, even though as a husband, you should be open and transparent to your wife. But people's stuff is not supposed to be discussed, especially when it's brought to you as a pastor, right? Because every friend has a friend, right? So if Pastor Collins tells me something and I have a friend, I may tell that friend. So it's really important that you keep people's trauma and you find them the resources to help them. If you cannot help them, don't hurt them, right? If you know you cannot be in spaces of recovery and supporting each other, do not participate in those spaces. But the church can have like a counseling session, or it can have a number, like a hotline to call, right? We know people who have hotlines to call when they are suicidal, they're more likely not to kill themselves, right? So just having that resource, okay, I can call Pastor Collins to talk about this. And I know Pastor Collins can keep a lot of things, because I know there are a lot of things that has happened and, he has kept. So it's really important to, create safe spaces that people will come in and be safe and leave their troubles at the table and not fear that it will be told outside.
Excellent.
Right?
Excellent. Get a little clap offering. Excellent. Excellent. So we will take a question or two. One of the ways that we address this here is I normally do one-on-one meeting at a coffee shop with people. Even though there are those that have been running away for 6 years from those meetings, I'm not sure why. But there are people who've met me in those meetings, and they are just grateful that we're able to sit to talk one-on-one. So I want to thank you. Anybody has a question that is really burning on your heart that you want her to answer, then we'll try to do communion and take offering. Any question? Yes.
Dr. Boyce, what would you say to someone who sexually traumatized, but most of the time the people that in our spaces, especially in our churches, they are male figures. And you know you need to talk about this, but now the person who is in front of you is a male. How do you deal with that?
That's a good question.
That's a really good question. And this is where, one of the slides showed that you need to really address historical, cultural, and gender issues when you're creating policies, right? So it's really important to see yourself in the eyes of the victim, right? Even if Pastor Collins is a male, right, and he cannot empathize with you because he didn't go through it, he may, have a sister or mom or someone who went through it, right? So just having a conversation and say, something happened to me, right? But I want to be able to have a conversation, not from a place of judgmental, right? I don't want to be judged, but one, right, test the water and say, Pastor Collins, I want to talk to you about this, right? If you don't have the resources, can you find me the resources that, because more than likely, if you tell your story, you will be surprised. Someone else have that same story, right? So it is important. That's why the church is a place of refuge. Even if you call and say, well, I may not want to talk to Pastor Collins. I want to talk to his wife, Sis Rebecca. It's important that you find someone that will empathize with you. It may not be that experience, right? But it may be a close family member or friend. And people often, solidarity is important, meaning that regardless of what you went through, I stand with you. Because even if it wasn't me, right, it was a sister, it was a friend. So it's really important that if you have issues, you tell pastor and say, well, I may not be comfortable talking to you because you're a male, right? But then he will come back and say, don't do that, because I have sisters, I have people who went through that, and he telling you those experiences may help you be more open to do it. Or you can be preferential and say, I want a pastor who is a female, right, who can relate to me better because of gender issues. I think it's up to you to be able to just speak up and say what you are comfortable with. That's what I would recommend.
Good. Yeah.
Dr. Boyce says that we do have spiritual leaders, but some are not licensed or educated in dealing with trauma. So even as you were talking to us here today, there are some things that some of us remembered. So that's why I'm asking the question, because I may trust Pastor Collins, I may trust Elder Collins, but they're not educated to do with the trauma that most of us struggle with in our community. And so we deal with it from the African perspective. Mm-hmm. We talk to you, and then we pray with you, and we hope it is resolved. Mm-hmm. But it's not.
Correct. So that is when Pastor Collins gauging in and say, well, this is how we are going to deal with it spiritually, right? You have two arms. This is how I'm going to work with you, so we build resilience with our faith, right? And have healing and restoration in Christ. But then also, this is a resource. I'm going to call a mental health specialist who I know, right? Connor Gray is a mental health specialist. He's in the church here. He may not have all of the answers, but he has a network of people who he can refer out. So having a source in the church and having also a list of resources externally so that you are dealing with things spiritually here, because that's his expertise, right? But then also referring out when there's a need to.
I saw the hand, but let me just address that. So one of the reasons why we are having this conversation, because I've had extensive research on it. I also graduated from the Minnesota Peace Building Leadership Institute, where we did trauma-informed study for several weeks, Dr. Mentor. So I have a little bit of background. My wife has a background in psychology. So I'm not saying we are expert, but we combine what we know plus faith, and we think that we've seen the result. I've had to deal with my own trauma by using these resources. So thank you so much for that. Yes?
Yeah, so my question is, what will you say to a couple that, one person have been like in foster homes, in so many homes, they have, sexual abuse and all that, and they come into a relationship that, they confide in their partner, and then that partner use that, think against them. Like, what would you say to both couples?
Yeah. Re-traumatizing, right?
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, so there's an error in that that's the mistake we make, right? We think love is everything, and love is not enough, right? This is where before you even get in a relationship, someone said to me, there's 3 questions you need to ask someone. One is, what is the expression of faith and how it shows up? So it's not okay to just say you're a Christian. How do you live your Christian life? The second one is, what was the most traumatic thing that you experienced in your childhood and how you dealt with it, right? If that person is unhealed, then even before you get to the premarital counseling, it is your responsibility to find them help. Because if that person is not whole, marry them would be detrimental to you, right? So I think that's where we need to have conversations before we even get in relationships. And when you're in a marriage and you see some of the signs of that, right? Someone doesn't even need to tell you, because people sometimes, even in marriages, they're scared to, like you said, say what they've been through because they're scared that it will be used against them, right? But even if you see signs, shame, guilt, being withdrawn and stuff, can we talk to a therapist, right? Can we talk to someone who can be able to help us through this? Because if you don't seek help, whether it is in the church or outside of the church, you're not going to have a happy marriage. So I would say those conversations should happen in the dating stage, or before you even get to that stage. It should happen in pre-marital counseling. And if the person has this thing that they're dealing with, I tell someone, I go to therapy, right? Therapy is a good thing, right? It's good for your mental health. People feel like they only talk to their therapist when there's a problem. No, you should be talking to your therapist before a problem, so it prevents you from having a problem. So even as couple, to have couple therapy, most insurance companies here pay for a mental health session. To have therapy, imagine it will let loose a lot of things that you will learn through that process, even as your spouse is going through it, so you can be able to help them, right? And that's what I would say to you. Have those conversations before you get married. If it is uncomfortable having to have that conversation in marriage, then it's best to engage a pastor during a counseling session or find a therapist who can help you navigate those conversations.
Okay, we'll take one question and we'll close. Yes? Please give her the mic.
Yeah, my question, I don't know if this should be a question but I have to mention this. So, like my previous relationship, and he was in the military. And from the military, he have a lot of experience from trauma and PSD. He was in the Marine, and he had a lot of experience from trauma. And when he, like, you know, a lot of things from there, and when he and I met, like, I feel that because what you were saying right now, I just feel a little bit like, kind of like guilty, and me not trying to help. But again, the other way, you know, it was a lot of things going on with him, and sometimes, like, he would talk about committing suicide, and I would call the suicide hotline, and it was a lot of things going on. And as a woman, I feel like I was just kind of like thinking, so I was not really kind of helping this man, or because he came from the army and he already traumatized, he already had PSD and going through a lot from the war. So, and he and I met, like he was drinking, you know, smoking from all those, he passed. And as a woman, I was trying my best so much for him to stop, and it was not helping. In our relationship, it was just a lot of things going on again. So right now, I came here and I was just thinking about me seeing a therapist because for my children, because I'm traumatized too from the relationship. And I don't want to react when I think about it and to react to my children. So the last time I was talking to my little cousin, I said, you know what? I went through a lot. I need to see the therapist and for them to help me to talk with me, to calm down, like whatever I went through for me to be able to how to raise my children, for me to not be too